The auctioneer's gavel hit the wooden podium so hard that dust rose from the floorboards, and every woman on that stage flinched except one, the cross-eyed girl at the end of the line who simply crossed her arms tighter and stared somewhere between the crowd and the far wall, her chin lifted like she dared anyone to say a single word about it. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Redstone Creek, Colorado Territory, had the kind of May afternoon that couldn't make up its mind between blazing and bitter. The mountains in the distance still wore their white caps with pride, but down on Main Street, the mud had begun to dry into ruts deep enough to swallow a man's boot hole. The saloon was full to bursting, and not because of the whiskey, though that certainly helped, but because Widow Hartwell's annual bride selection had drawn every unmarried man within 50 miles, and a good number of married ones who just wanted to watch. The women on the stage were not sold like cattle, or at least that was what Widow Hartwell always insisted when the newspapers in Denver tried to call it what it plainly was. She preferred the word arrangement. A fee was paid, a contract was signed, and a woman who had no other prospects in the brutal arithmetic of frontier life went home with a man who had land, tools, and presumably enough decency to treat her fairly. The women came from back east, mostly, responding to advertisements in papers from Philadelphia to Cincinnati. Some came with hope shining in their eyes. Some came because they had absolutely nothing left to lose. Maggie Calloway had come with a battered carpetbag, 22 years of stubbornness, and eyes that had been drifting inward since she was 4 years old. She stood at the far end of the stage, fifth in a line of 5, and she had already watched 4 women get selected. Agnes Bloom, with her copper hair and wide smile, had gone in the first 30 seconds to a young rancher who nearly tripped over himself getting to the contract table. Ruth Simmons, quiet and pale as milk, had taken nearly 3 minutes, but a farmer from up the valley had paid his fee with hands that shook from nervousness rather than age. The third and fourth women, sisters from Ohio named Clara and Dottie, had been taken together by a pair of brothers who farmed adjacent plots and had ridden down together specifically hoping for that exact arrangement. Then there was Maggie. Widow Hartwell had spent 4 increasingly uncomfortable minutes describing Maggie's virtues. She could cook, she could sew. She was strong as a mule, and here Widow Hartwell had the grace to look slightly apologetic for the comparison. She had no family debts, no outstanding obligations, no history of illness. She was, in point of fact, a perfectly capable woman who would make any man an exceptional helpmate on the frontier. The crowd said nothing. Not one hand went up. A man near the back coughed. Someone's horse, tied to the rail outside, chose that exact moment to whinny as though offering its own editorial opinion. Maggie's jaw tightened. She felt the heat rising up her neck toward her face, and she refused to let it get there. She had known, stepping off the stagecoach in Redstone Creek 2 days ago, that this was going to happen. She had not been naive about it. Her eyes had been the subject of commentary for her entire life. The gentle cruelty of children, the more sophisticated cruelty of adults who framed their observations as concern. She had built herself a wall, stone by stone, and she stood behind it now on this rickety stage and let the silence wash over her like the cold river water she had bathed in that morning back at Widow Hartwell's boarding house. It was fine, she told herself. She would figure something out. She always did. What she did not account for was the man who had been standing at the back of the crowd the entire time, not looking at the stage, instead looking at the mountains with the expression of someone who had come to town for feed and nails, and had stopped to watch the proceedings the way a person stops to watch a river, without particular intent, just because it was there. His name was Caleb Holt, and he was, in the frank estimation of every person in Redstone Creek who had occasion to notice such things, an enormous man. He stood 6 feet and 3 inches in his boots, with shoulders that had been built not in any gymnasium, but across 12 years of felling timber, hauling stone, and working a homestead in the foothills that he had carved out of raw wilderness with little more than determination and a good axe. His hair was dark brown and fell to the base of his neck in a way that suggested he cut it himself when he remembered to do it at all. His jaw was strong, permanently shadowed with dark stubble, and his hands, resting now on the fence rail at the back of the crowd, were the hands of a man who had never been able to entirely clean the work from them. He was 31 years old and had not, until approximately 45 seconds ago, had the faintest intention of participating in Widow Hartwell's arrangement. Then the silence had gone on too long. He had heard it happen, the auctioneer's voice dropping into that particular register of discomfort that meant things were going wrong for someone, and Caleb Holt had an involuntary and inconvenient habit of noticing when things went wrong for people. He turned from the mountains and looked at the stage for the first time since the proceedings had started. He saw a young woman with dark auburn hair pinned severely back from a face that was, in his immediate assessment, pretty in the way that honest things are pretty, not decorated or arranged, just genuine. Her eyes pointed slightly inward, which his brain registered and filed away as something that was simply true about her, the way the grain of a particular piece of wood was simply true about it. What caught his attention and held it was the set of her jaw and the position of her arms, folded across her chest like she was the one judging the crowd and finding it wanting, not the other way around. He almost smiled. He turned back to the mountains for another moment, having a brief but intense internal argument with himself about the general wisdom of what he was considering. The mountains, as usual, gave him no useful advice. He turned back, pushed off the fence, and walked through the crowd toward the contract table. "I will take her," he said, loud enough that the auctioneer heard him before he even reached the front. The crowd turned. The auctioneer's expression moved through surprise, relief, and professional composure in rapid succession. Widow Hartwell, standing to the side of the stage, put one hand over her heart. On the stage, Maggie Calloway's arms uncrossed very slowly. Her eyes, both of them in their individual directions, focused somewhere in the region of the large man walking through the parting crowd, and her chin came down by perhaps half an inch from its defiant angle. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She watched him reach the contract table and speak to the clerk in a low, unhurried voice, and she thought several things at once, most of which she had the good sense not to say out loud. The first was that he was very, very large. The second was that she had not the slightest intention of being grateful to anyone for anything. The third, which she pushed down quickly and efficiently, was that he had not once looked at her the way the rest of the crowd had, with that particular mixture of pity and embarrassment, and that this was, despite everything, a remarkable thing. Caleb signed the contract without reading the fine print as carefully as he probably should have, paid the fee with money he had been saving to buy a new plow, and walked to the base of the stage steps. He looked up at Maggie with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a question, something in between. "I'm Caleb Holt," he said. "I have a homestead about 8 miles north. It's not fancy." Maggie came down the steps with her carpet bag and stood in front of him. The top of her head reached his chin, which meant she had to tip it upward slightly to look in his direction, and she did so with the air of a woman who refused to find anything about this situation intimidating. "Maggie Calloway," she said. "I cook, sew, and keep a clean house. I am not, however, inclined to be docile, and if you purchased me under that impression, you are going to be disappointed." Something shifted in his eyes, a brief, bright thing that was gone before it fully arrived. "I didn't purchase you," he said. "I paid a fee for an arrangement. That is the polite way to say the same thing." "Maybe," he allowed. "Are you coming?" She picked up her carpet bag. "I do not appear to have a compelling alternative." He took the carpet bag from her without asking, which she found simultaneously presumptuous and practical, and led her to where his wagon was tied beside the mercantile. The wagon was solid and well-maintained, which told her something. The horse was a sturdy roan gelding that regarded her with mild interest. Caleb lifted her carpet bag into the bed of the wagon as though it weighed nothing, which, given the size of his arms, it likely did not. He helped her up onto the bench seat, and his hand, when it closed around her arm to steady her, was warm and entirely ungentle in the way that only truly careful people can manage, present and real without being rough. She sat very straight on the bench as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon began to move, rattling out of Redstone Creek and onto the road that wound north toward the foothills. Neither of them said anything for almost a mile. It was Maggie who broke first, which she would later insist was not breaking at all, merely practical communication. "I should tell you," she said, looking straight ahead at the road, "that I am aware of the nature of my eyes. You do not need to address it or avoid it. It is simply a condition I have had since childhood, and it has no bearing on my ability to work or think clearly." Caleb guided the horse around a deep rut in the road. "All right," he said. She waited for more. There was no more. "That is your entire response?" she asked. "What else would you like me to say?" "Most people find something to add." "I'm not most people," he said, which was, she would come to realize, both the truest and most useful thing he could have told her on that first afternoon. The road north climbed gradually, leaving the flat bottom of the valley for the gentler slopes of the foothills. The scrub oak and cottonwood gave way to thicker stands of pine, and the air changed, cooler and sharper, smelling of resin and cold water. To the west, the Rocky Mountains rose in their great unruly mass against the afternoon sky, the snow on the peaks catching the light in ways that made Maggie, despite herself, stop thinking about the situation she was in and simply look. "It's beautiful," she said before she could stop herself. Caleb looked at the mountains with the comfortable ease of a man who had been looking at them for years and still found them worthwhile. "It gets better," he said. "Wait until you see it from the homestead." The homestead, when it came into view around a long bend in the road, was not what Maggie had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. It sat in a natural bowl between two long ridges of pine-covered hillside, positioned to catch the morning sun and sheltered from the worst of the north wind. The house itself was larger than she had anticipated, a solid log structure with a real wood plank floor that she could see through the open doorway, a good stone chimney, and glass windows on the south-facing wall. There was a barn that was obviously newer than the house, a root cellar with a heavy door, a kitchen garden plot that had been turned and was waiting for planting, and a split-rail fence running along the creek that cut through the lower pasture. It was not fancy. He had told her that honestly, but it was solid and considered and built by someone who paid attention to details like drainage and wind and where the sun hit in the winter. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. The original cabin was already here when I claimed the land. I've added to it." She climbed down from the wagon. He was already there to steady her, which she accepted because the step-down was genuinely high, and walked slowly across the yard, looking at everything with the systematic attention of a woman taking inventory. The kitchen garden was well placed. The root cellar was smart. The distance from the house to the outhouse was appropriate. The wood stack beside the house was enormous, which in this climate was not excess but necessity. "When was this all started?" she asked. "I filed the claim in '68. Been working it since." 6 years, she calculated. 6 years of one man building this alone in the foothills of the Rockies. The scale of the work it represented settled over her differently once she had that number. She looked at the breadth of his shoulders with new understanding. "Where do you want me to sleep?" she asked, because the question had to be asked and she preferred to ask it directly than to circle around it with misery and implication. He led her inside without apparent awkwardness. The main room held a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and shelving built directly into the log walls. A second room off the back held a bed, and through the window she could see a smaller structure, a lean-to addition he had built against the back wall. "I thought you might want the main room until you're comfortable," he said. "I set up a bed in the lean-to. It's warm enough with the stove going." She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, without any particular expression that she could read. "That is unusually considerate," she said. "I'm not a complicated man, Miss Calloway. I signed a paper today that says I'm to be your husband. I figure that means I'm to behave like one worth having." There was something in the way he said it, plain and honest without performance, that she found more disarming than any eloquence would have been. She looked away before whatever was rising in her chest could get any further. "Maggie," she said, "not Miss Calloway." "Maggie," he said. The first week was a negotiation. It was not an unpleasant one, but it was constant and real. 2 people of strong character learning the geography of each other. Maggie woke early. She had always woken early. It was one of the things she was certain about herself, and had the stove going and coffee made before Caleb appeared from the lean-to in the gray pre-dawn light. He stopped in the doorway the first morning with an expression of mild surprise that he did not try very hard to hide. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I am aware," she said, and handed him the coffee. He sat at the table and drank it, and she watched him wake up the way some people watch the sun rise. Not deliberately, just because it was happening and she was facing that direction. He was fully dressed and his boots were already on, which meant he had put them on in the lean-to, which meant he had not expected to walk through the main room and be observed in any state of informality. She noted this as data. He ate the breakfast she made, beans and cornbread, because that was what was in the kitchen, with no complaints and no particular commentary, said, "Thank you," with the uncomplicated directness of a man who found gratitude easy to express and went outside to start work. She watched him through the south window as she washed the dishes. He moved around the property with the focused efficiency of a man who always had more work than hours, but without the frantic edge that desperation gave a person. He knew what he was doing, and he did it steadily. She went outside after she had set the house in order and looked at the kitchen garden. The soil had been turned but not amended, and she could see by its color and texture that it would benefit from the compost she had noticed building in a pile near the barn. She spent the morning working the compost into the turned beds, which was not light work. It required hauling and spreading and kneeling, but she did not find hard work objectionable. Caleb came around the side of the barn at midday and stopped when he saw what she had done. "You didn't have to do that," he said for the second time in less than a day. "That is becoming your most common phrase," she said, sitting back on her heels and looking up at him. "I'm not here to sit still and be ornamental." The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." He brought water from the creek in the afternoon without her asking, filling the barrel beside the house because the bucket system she had been using was slow, and he had apparently noticed. She noticed him noticing, and found she did not know what to do with it, so she planted the first row of beans instead. The trouble started on day 4, over the matter of the chicken coop. Caleb had chickens, 6 of them, brown and self-important, living in a coop at the corner of the yard that had, in Maggie's professional estimation, not been cleaned in a period of time she preferred not to calculate precisely. She cleaned it, thoroughly, and in doing so, reorganized the laying boxes in a configuration that made, from her point of view, considerably more sense. Caleb discovered this in the evening and stood in the doorway of the coop with an expression she was learning to read as something between startled and thoughtful. "The boxes were in the wrong place," she said from behind him. "They've been in that place for 3 years, he said. "The hens know where they are. The hens will adapt. They are not intellectually complex." He turned and looked at her with an expression that contained, she was certain, the embryo of a smile being actively suppressed. "You moved everything in that coop." "I cleaned everything in that coop. The moving was incidental." "Did it occur to you to ask me?" It had not occurred to her to ask him. This was, she acknowledged privately, a fair point. "I will ask in the future," she said, "about things that are genuinely a matter of preference." The cleaning was not a matter of preference. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the reorganized coop. Then he closed the door. "The hens will probably be fine," he said. She smiled at his back, small and private, and gone before he could have turned to see it. The hens, for the record, were fine. They laid 3 eggs the next morning, which was one more than usual. What Maggie had not prepared for, what she had, in fact, been careful to not allow herself to imagine as any kind of genuine possibility, was that Caleb Holt might be, in the plainest and most straightforward way, a good man. She had known men. She had grown up with a father who spent most of her childhood measuring her shortcomings against standards she could not meet, and she had watched men in the town of her childhood interact with women in ways that ranged from indifferent to actively discouraging. She had come west with no illusions about frontier marriage being a romantic proposition. She had expected to work hard, which was fine. She had expected to be largely unappreciated, which was at least familiar. She had expected to manage her own interior life in private, which was simply what she had always done. She had not expected Caleb Holt to sit across the dinner table from her on the 5th night, look at her directly in the way he had, steady and attentive, as though she were a thing worth looking at, and say, out of the context of any conversation they were having, "Tell me about where you came from." She had been cutting cornbread, and she paused with the knife in her hand and looked at him, or rather, looked in his direction, which was how it always worked, both eyes finding their way toward their own resting places rather than converging neatly. "Why?" she asked. "Because we're going to be spending a considerable amount of time in each other's company," he said, "and I'd rather know who you are." It was such an uncomplicated statement of such a perfectly reasonable thing that she found she could not construct an objection to it. "Ohio," she said, "a town called Milford. My father ran the mill, which is how it got its name, or how he always told it, though I never confirmed whether the name came first." She paused. "My mother died when I was 9. After that I kept house, and my father remarried when I was 14. My stepmother was not unkind, but we were never easy together. I left when I was 19 and went to Cincinnati and worked in a boarding house for 3 years, then worked in a dress shop, then answered the advertisement." "Why the advertisement?" he asked, not challengingly, just asking. "Because Cincinnati offered me the same thing in every direction," she said, "and I wanted something different, even if different was uncertain." He nodded as though that made sense to him, which, she supposed, it might. He was a man who had come to Colorado Territory and filed a land claim and built a homestead by himself, which was its own variety of choosing uncertainty over sameness. "What about you?" she asked, because the question was only fair. "Kentucky," he said, "near the Tennessee border. My father and 2 brothers. I came west in '66 after the war." She noted what he did not say, that he had been in the war, that the war had done what wars do to people, that he had come west because the East held things he needed distance from. She did not ask, because she recognized the shape of things that were not being said yet, and she had enough respect for the process of trust to let it move at its own pace. "Did you fight?" she asked, which was within the permissible range. "Union cavalry," he said, 2 years. "And your father and brothers?" "Father stayed home. Brothers fought for the other side." He said this with the flat, careful neutrality of something long looked at. "Father died in '67. Brothers and I, we don't write much." "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said. And then, with a decisiveness that she understood was a closing of a door rather than a dismissal. "More coffee?" She held out her cup. The thing about Caleb was that he listened. Maggie did not realize quite how unusual this was until she found herself talking more than she normally did. Not compulsively, not filling silence with noise, but actually saying things that were inside her and finding that he received them without judgment and without the particular variety of dismissiveness that she had grown so accustomed to from men in her experience that she had stopped expecting anything different. He asked her about Cincinnati. He asked her about the dress shop. He asked, one evening while they were both sitting on the porch watching the last of the daylight leave the mountains, what she would have been if circumstances had been different. "A teacher," she said, without hesitation. He looked at her. "I like the idea of knowing things and then giving the knowledge away," she said. "It seems like the right direction for things to move." He was quiet for a moment. "There's no school in Redstone Creek," he said. "Family's been trying to get one organized for 2 years. Can't find anyone to commit to it." "I know," she said. "I heard about it at Widow Hartwell's." She paused. "I did not think it was a reasonable expectation under the circumstances." "Why not?" he asked. She looked at him, genuinely surprised by the question. "I mean it," he said. "Why not?" She turned it over in her mind, the actual answer rather than the reflexive one, and came up with something that she said more quietly. "Because I assumed you would need me here." "I need you here some of the time," he said. "Not all of it. The town needs a teacher." He looked back at the mountains. "Something to think about." She thought about it. She thought about it rather more than she intended to, lying in the main room that night with the fire banked low and the mountains visible through the window as a darker darkness against the sky. The justice of it, that she had come west with this capability and this desire, and had simply assumed it was not available to her, moved through her chest like an uncomfortable and necessary thing. She was not, she realized, in the situation she had believed herself to be in. She had climbed onto that stage in Redstone Creek, expecting the worst version of the future available to her, and had received instead Caleb Holt, with his steady eyes and his enormous careful hands, and his complete apparent inability to find her remarkable for any of the reasons she had been remarkable her whole life. She did not know what to do with this, but she was beginning to think she would like to find out. 3 weeks after she arrived at the homestead, a man came to the door. His name was Rance Bullock, and he was the kind of man the frontier seemed to produce in unpleasant quantities, lean and sun-damaged, with eyes that moved too quickly and a smile that occupied his face without reaching anywhere important. He came in the early afternoon when Caleb was up on the north ridge checking the fence line, which Maggie suspected was not a coincidence. She answered the door with flour on her hands and a look on her face that had stopped less committed men in their tracks. "Afternoon," said Rance Bullock. "Is Holt here?" "He is not," she said. "He will be back by evening. I can give him a message." Bullock looked at her with the calculating slowness of a man recalibrating. "You must be the bride," he said. "I am Maggie Holt," she said, which was the first time she had used that name, and the firmness with which she deployed it surprised even her. "What is your business with my husband?" "Land business," said Bullock. "He'll know what it means." "Then I'll tell him you called." She began to close the door. "Friendly out here, aren't you?" said Bullock, and the smile on his face changed quality in a way she did not like. "Friendly enough," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bullock." She closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment, listening to the sound of his horse moving away from the yard. She told Caleb that evening as she served dinner, describing Bullock with the precision of a woman who had paid close attention. Caleb's expression darkened in a contained way, like a sky going overcast, not dramatic, but meaningful. "Rance Bullock," he said. "He's been trying to buy the lower section of my land for 2 years. The creek runs through it, and he wants the water rights." "You're not inclined to sell?" "This land belongs to itself," he said, which was the most poetic thing she had heard him say. Then, more practically, "He's not someone I want coming around when I'm not here." "I'm perfectly capable of managing an unwanted visitor," she said. "I don't doubt that," he said, "but I'd prefer to be here anyway." There was something in the way he said it, not controlling, not dismissive of her capability, but a simple statement of preference rooted in protectiveness, that she found she did not object to the way she would have objected to many things from many men. She looked at him across the table. "All right," she said. The thing she was feeling, she told herself, was simply the natural development of familiarity. It was gratitude, expressed as warmth. It was the reasonable response of a person to finding someone trustworthy after years of their absence. It was not, she insisted firmly to herself, anything that required further examination. She was lying, but she was not yet ready to stop. The moment she stopped being able to lie to herself arrived approximately 6 weeks after she had come to the homestead, on a Tuesday evening in late June, when the air was warm and smelled of the wild roses that grew along the creek bank. She had been in the garden when she turned her ankle on the uneven ground. Nothing serious, a sharp pain and a moment's loss of balance, and she had sat down abruptly in the dirt between the bean rows and said a word she did not usually say in company. Caleb had been within earshot, cutting wood at the side of the house, and he was beside her in what seemed like an unreasonably short time for a man covering that distance. He knelt in the dirt without apparent concern for his trousers, took her ankle in both hands with extraordinary gentleness, and turned it slowly, watching her face. "Tell me where it hurts," he said. "It is not serious," she said. "Tell me where it hurts," he said again, the same way, and the repetition was not impatient or forceful. It was simply the steady insistence of a man who was going to get the information he needed to help her. She told him. He moved the ankle carefully, nodded, sat back on his heels. "Twisted, not broken," he said. "You should stay off it for the rest of today." "I have dinner to start," she said. "I can make dinner," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with complete unironic sincerity. "You can make dinner?" she said. "I made dinner every night for 6 years before you got here," he said. "I'm not a talented cook, but I can make dinner." She laughed. It came out before she had any opportunity to decide about it, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it hung in the warm evening air for a moment like something bright. He looked at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face, just for that moment, unguarded, was something she had not seen on a face directed at her before. It was simple and full, and it was looking at her the way the sun comes around a hill and falls on a specific thing and makes it suddenly, undeniably visible. He helped her to her feet with his hand warm and steady under her arm, and he did not let go until she was standing firmly, and the moment his hand left her arm, she felt the absence of it in a way that alarmed her considerably. She sat on the porch with her ankle propped on a stool, and he made dinner. It was, as advertised, not talented. The beans were oversalted and the cornbread was slightly burnt at the bottom. She ate every bite and told him it was fine. "It's not fine," he said, cutting the burnt part off his cornbread with a knife, "but it's food." "It is fine," she said, more firmly than the cornbread objectively merited. He looked at her, and again, that thing in his eyes, brief as a flash of reflected light. That night she lay in the main room and looked at the fire burning low and admitted to herself with the brisk honesty she preferred to apply to all important matters. She was falling in love with Caleb Holt, and she was going to have to decide what to do about it. The decision was made for her, in a manner of speaking, by Rance Bullock. He came back on a Thursday morning at the end of June, this time when Caleb was in the barn and visible through the yard, which told Maggie that Bullock had decided on a different approach. He came with a friend this time, a large man she did not know, and they rode into the yard with the particular slow deliberateness of men who were making a demonstration of their confidence. Caleb came out of the barn and stood in the yard. He did not walk toward them, and he did not back up. He simply stood, and Maggie, watching from the window, understood for the first time with her whole body what the word immovable actually meant when it described a person. She could not hear what was said, but she watched the conversation from the window, and she watched Caleb's posture, and she watched Bullock's, and she watched the moment when Bullock understood that whatever he had come to accomplish was not going to happen today or on any other day. When they rode away, she went to the door. Caleb was standing in the yard looking after them with an expression that was not anger, but something more serious and more considered than anger. "What did he want?" she asked. "See? Same thing." He paused. "He added to it today. Said if I wasn't interested in selling the lower section, he'd be interested in talking to you about it." She went very still. "Excuse me?" "He suggested," Caleb said with careful control, "that a woman recently arrived from back east might have a different view of the land's value than I do." The silence that followed was of a particular quality that Caleb apparently understood, because he looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved briefly in something that was not quite a smile. "I told him," he said, "that my wife knows the value of this land better than I do, and that she's considerably more stubborn than I am, so he was welcome to try." She stared at him. "You told him that?" "It's true," he said simply, and walked back to the barn. She stood in the doorway for a long moment after he disappeared inside, with the June sun warm on her face, and she thought, "I am not falling in love with Caleb Holt. I have already fallen, and the falling is over, and this is what the ground feels like on the other side." That evening, after dinner, when the mountain light was doing the extraordinary thing it did on clear evenings, the sky going from blue to rose to a deep luminous purple that made the snow on the peaks look like something that had been set on fire, she sat next to him on the porch and said, "I would like to talk to the town council about the school." He looked at her. "If the offer is genuine," she said, "if what you said 3 weeks ago was an actual suggestion and not a conversational observation." "It was genuine," he said. "Then I would like to go to Redstone Creek on Saturday when you go for supplies and speak to someone about it." She paused. "If that's all right with you." He looked at her steadily. "Maggie," he said, "you don't need my permission." "I am aware," she said. "I'm asking because I want to go with you, not because I require your approval." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Saturday," he said. "We'll go together." She nodded, looking at the mountains turning purple, and he said nothing more, and she said nothing more, and the silence between them on that porch was, she realized, the most comfortable silence she had ever sat in. The trip to Redstone Creek on Saturday was the first time they had been in town together since the day of the arrangement, and Maggie noticed the way people looked at them, the quickly averted eyes, the reassessed expressions, the particular recalibration of a small community encountering something that contradicted its prior assessment. She found she cared about this considerably less than she would have expected. She had a brief, excellent meeting with Ezra Whitmore, who chaired the town's informal school committee, a narrow, cheerful man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who nearly fell over himself with enthusiasm when she outlined her qualifications. He pressed her hand at the conclusion of the meeting and said they would have a decision by the following week. She found Caleb at the mercantile afterward, loading the wagon with supplies, and told him about the meeting while he lifted sacks of flour that would have challenged most men significantly. He seemed eager, she said. Ezra Whitmore would be eager, Caleb said. He has 4 children and nowhere to send them for schooling. He loaded the last sack and straightened and looked at her. How do you feel? The question surprised her. What do you mean? The meeting, how do you feel about it? She thought about it honestly. Hopeful, she said, which is not my customary state. Maybe it should be, he said, and handed her up onto the wagon. On the way back, they passed through the lower part of the valley where the creek road was shaded by cottonwoods, and Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop without apparent purpose. She looked at him questioningly. He reached under the wagon seat and produced, with the uncomplicated directness he applied to everything, a small paper packet. He held it out to her. I saw them at the mercantile, he said. Thought you might want them. She opened the packet. Inside were seeds. Sweet pea seeds, the kind you planted along a fence line for the flowers, not for any practical purpose, purely because they were beautiful. She looked at them for a moment. They are not practical, she said. No, he said. You did not need to buy them, she said. I know, he said. And then, with the same unhurried plainness with which he said everything, I wanted to. She closed her fingers around the packet. She did not trust her voice at that particular moment, so she nodded, and he picked up the reins, and the wagon moved on through the cottonwood shade. She planted the sweet pea seeds along the south fence the following morning, and for the first time since she had been old enough to understand what her particular variety of being extraordinary cost in practical terms, she let herself want something that was not useful. She wanted those flowers to grow. She wanted to see them. She wanted them because they were beautiful, and because he had seen them and thought of her. She pressed the seeds into the soft dirt one by one, and each one was a small act of hope that felt, in the particular brightness of that July morning, like the bravest thing she had ever done. The letter came from the school committee on a Wednesday. Ezra Whitmore himself drove out to deliver it, arriving in a cloud of dust and good news. Maggie was offered the position of teacher at the Redstone Creek school to begin in September when the new schoolroom was completed at a salary of $22 per month. She would teach 3 days a week and could manage the schedule as she saw fit. She read the letter twice, standing in the yard, and then she read it a third time. Ezra Whitmore watched her with the expression of a man waiting for someone to open a present. Well, he said. Yes, she said. I accept. He drove away wreathed in satisfaction, and she stood in the yard with the letter in her hand, and when Caleb came down from the north pasture an hour later, she held it out to him without preamble. He read it. He handed it back. He looked at her with the full, direct attention that was the most specifically him thing about him. Congratulations, he said. The word landed differently than she expected. Not the bright performative congratulations of social obligation, but something quieter and more real. Recognition, not celebration. He was seeing her again, she thought, simply and completely seeing her. Thank you, she said, for suggesting it. You did the work, he said. You opened the door. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him, her eyes finding their own directions and still managing, somehow, to land on him, and something passed between them that was not spoken and did not need to be. Not yet. But it was there, solid and real, the way the mountains were real, not going anywhere, simply present and enormous and absolutely true. It was August when things finally broke open between them, the way things break in the summer, not violently but completely, a season's worth of building heat finding its release all at once. The night began ordinarily enough. They had eaten dinner and cleared the table, and Caleb had gone out to check on the horses before settling for the evening, which was his habit. Maggie had been sitting at the table by the lamp working on lesson plans for September. She had filled 3 pages already with ideas she would have to scale back for the practical reality of a mixed-age classroom when he came back inside and did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room instead, and she looked up, and something in his face stopped her. "Sit down," she said, not as a directive, but as an invitation. He sat. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them, which was the first time she had ever seen him study his hands rather than look at whatever was actually in front of him. "I've been trying to figure out," he said carefully, "how to say something." She put the pen down. "I'm not a man who's good with words," he said. "I know that. I know what I feel more clearly than I know how to say it." He looked up. "But I think I need to say it anyway, because it seems like the kind of thing that ought to be said." She waited. She had gone very still. "When I walked over to that contract table in May," he said, "I told myself it was because no one else was going to, and I don't like watching someone stand there getting smaller while the world ignores them." He paused. "That was part of it. But there was another part that I knew even then, though I didn't examine it, which was that I looked at you on that stage and I thought you were the most honestly yourself person I had ever seen." She had been holding her breath without knowing it. "I've been living on this land alone for 6 years, he said. "I told myself I was fine with that. I think I believed it. But you came here and you planted those beans and you cleaned that chicken coop without permission, and you told me you weren't inclined to be docile. And Maggie—" He stopped. He started again. "This is your home. That is not just the paper I signed. I want it to actually be your home, and I want—" He stopped again, and she understood that the words were genuinely hard for him, that this cost him something real, and that the cost was what made it true. "I want to be your husband," he said, "not in the arrangement sense, in the actual sense." The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the creek ran over its stones in the dark, and the mountains stood in their indifferent enormity. And in the warm, August kitchen of a homestead in the Colorado foothills, Maggie Calloway looked at Caleb Holt and felt the last carefully constructed stone of her wall come loose and fall. "You already are," she said. He looked at her. "My husband," she said. "You have been actually that since approximately the 3rd week. I have been aware of it, and I have been a coward about it, and I apologize for the cowardice." She folded her hands on the table. "I came here expecting nothing, and I received you, which is not what I had planned for, and I find that I am—" She paused and picked her words with the same care he had, because it was that kind of truth. "I am very glad. For the first time in a long time, I am truly glad about something." He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his, those enormous, careful, calloused hands, and she turned hers over and held on. They sat like that for a long time, with the lamp between them and the August dark outside, and it was the simplest and most complete thing that had happened to either of them in longer than they could accurately say. He kissed her for the first time at the door of the lean-to, where they stood for a moment before the habit of the house would have sent them to their separate sleeping arrangements. He had looked at her for a moment in the low lamplight, and she had looked back, and then she had simply risen up on her toes, because the decision was clear, and she was not, fundamentally, a woman who stood around waiting once things were clear. His hands came up immediately to frame her face, gently, as though she were something he was afraid of mishandling, and the kiss was soft and real and entirely unhurried. When they separated, she was aware that she was smiling, and she did not try to stop it. "You were going to stand there and think about it," she said. "I was," he admitted. "You think too much," she said. "You never think too much," he said. "Between the two of us," she said, "we achieve the appropriate amount." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and it was warm and deep, and it made the whole kitchen feel brighter. "Go to sleep," he said. "Good night, Caleb," she said. "Good night, Maggie," he said. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time, not from anxiety, but from the particular wonderful unsettledness of a life changed at its foundations, like a tree during a good rain, not damaged, only deeply reached. They were married properly on a Saturday in early September in the parlor of the Redstone Creek Church, with Ezra Whitmore and his wife as witnesses, and Widow Hartwell in the second pew, looking deeply satisfied in the way of a person whose professional arrangements had worked out better than even she had hoped. The minister was a young man named Pastor Green, who had come from Boston and still seemed slightly startled by everything west of the Mississippi. But he read the words with genuine feeling. Maggie wore a dress she had made herself from blue cotton she had bought at the mercantile, and she had done her hair in a way she liked, simply pulled back from her face with a ribbon that matched the dress. She carried 3 stems of wild mountain flowers that Caleb had picked that morning with complete apparent unself-consciousness, holding them out to her at breakfast, as though presenting wildflowers to one's wife on the morning of one's wedding was the most natural thing in the world. It was. When Pastor Green pronounced them man and wife, Caleb took her face in both hands and kissed her, and Widow Hartwell made a sound that was suspiciously close to a sniffle, and Ezra Whitmore's wife clapped. They drove home in the wagon in the early afternoon, back up the valley road and through the cottonwood shade and around the long bend, and the homestead came into view with the late summer light on the log walls and the sweet pea vines along the south fence, which had grown beautifully and were blooming in purple and pink and white. Maggie had not known they would still be blooming in September. She looked at them and then looked at Caleb. "They bloomed," she said. He looked at them too. "They did," he said. She held his hand the rest of the way down the drive. The school opened in the second week of September. There were 11 children on the first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 14, sitting in 2 crooked rows on benches that the fathers of the town had built from fresh-cut lumber. The schoolroom smelled of pine resin and chalk, and the September sun came through the new windows and lay in long, bright strips across the floor. Maggie stood at the front and looked at 11 faces, curious, nervous, excited, bored, and felt something settle inside her so completely and precisely that it was like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting a long time. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Holt. I'm going to teach you to read, to calculate, to know the history of the country you live in, and to think carefully and honestly about the world. These are the most useful things I know. Everything else is secondary." 11 faces blinked at her. A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Yes?" she said. "My ma said you have funny eyes," he said, with the complete unfiltered accuracy of a 6-year-old. There was a silence of considerable discomfort from several of the older children. "Your mother is correct," Maggie said without missing a beat. "They point inward, which is a condition I was born with. It does not affect my ability to teach or your ability to learn. Now, who knows their letters?" 3 hands went up. 8 did not. She picked up her chalk. She walked home in the late afternoon with chalk dust on her hands and a deep satisfaction in her chest that was new and specific and entirely hers. And when she came around the bend in the road, she could see Caleb at the far end of the pasture repairing the south fence. He saw her coming and straightened, and even from that distance she could see him watching her, waiting. She waved. He raised one hand. She walked faster. She told him everything about the day over dinner, the boy in the front row, and his devastating honesty and the way she had handled it, the girl of 12 named Lily Whitmore, who read better than Maggie had expected and would need more challenging material, the boy of 10 who had told her with absolute certainty that girls couldn't do arithmetic. "What did you tell him?" Caleb asked. "I told him to watch and we would settle the question empirically," she said. "Then I did 47 times 32 in my head and wrote the answer on the board and asked him to verify it with pencil and paper." He was looking at her with that expression, the full, warm, entirely focused one. "Was he impressed?" Caleb asked. "He tried not to be," she said. He failed. The laughter between them that evening was easy and continuous, the kind of laughter that builds on itself in the presence of the right person, and she thought, this is what home is, not the walls or the roof or even the sweet peas on the fence. This exact room with this exact person. Fall came in hard in October, the way it did in the Colorado foothills, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in a single afternoon and the aspens going gold, and then shedding their gold all at once, so that walking through the hills was like walking through a previous season's memory. Caleb spent the fall days preparing the homestead for winter, cutting and stacking wood, winterizing the root cellar, banking the foundation of the house with earth to hold the warmth. He did this with the same steady, methodical determination with which he did everything, and Maggie worked alongside him when she was not at the school, because that was who she was. On an afternoon in late October, while they were stacking wood, Rance Bullock came for the last time. He came alone this time, which was either brave or stupid, and he rode in slowly and dismounted with the calculated ease of a man who had decided on a final approach. Caleb set down the wood he was carrying with absolute calm. "Bullock," he said. "Holt." Bullock looked at Maggie, who had stopped working and was looking at him with an expression that could have stripped paint. "Ma'am." He looked back at Caleb. "I'm prepared to make a final offer on the lower section. More than fair. Man could build a real house with that money. Buy more land up the valley." "I have a real house," Caleb said. "Better land then. Better location." "I like this location," Caleb said. Bullock looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, the calculation running its final numbers and coming up short. He looked at the homestead, at the house, at the stacked wood and the winterized garden and the sweet pea vines gone to seed along the south fence. "You're not going to sell," he said. "I'm not going to sell," Caleb said. Another long moment. Bullock nodded slowly, not agreeably, but with the particular acknowledgement of a man who has finally accepted a fact he has been arguing against for some time. "That's your right," he said. He put his boot back in the stirrup. "No hard feelings." "None at all," Caleb said. Bullock rode away. Caleb watched him go until he was gone around the bend, and then he picked up the piece of wood he had set down and resumed stacking. Maggie stood watching him for a moment. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," he said. "He just accepted it?" "A man like Bullock only keeps pushing until it costs him more than it's worth," Caleb said. "We've been making it cost." He glanced at her. "You helped with that." "I have not done anything." "You told him your name was Maggie Holt," he said. "First day he came, before you decided anything about anything." She remembered that. The firmness with which the name had come out, surprising even herself. "I was not going to let him think otherwise," she said. "I know," he said. He did not look at her when he said the next thing, just continued stacking wood with his back half turned, which was, she had come to understand, how he said his most important things. "That was the moment I knew for certain." She looked at his back. "Knew what?" "That you were going to stay," he said. "That you wanted to." She picked up a piece of wood and handed it to him. "Stack this," she said, because she trusted the wood and the work more than she trusted her voice at that particular moment. He took it and stacked it, and they did not say anything more. But when his hand brushed hers, reaching for the next piece, neither of them moved away. The first snow came on the 3rd of November, and it came with conviction, the way Colorado snow comes when it has finally made up its mind. 6 inches by morning and more coming, the sky the flat pewter gray of a commitment. The mountains disappeared entirely behind it, which always struck Maggie as an astonishing magic trick, given how absolutely fixed and permanent they normally seemed. The school had to close for 2 days, and Maggie stayed home and helped with the animals and cooked the kinds of food that cold weather demanded, thick bean soup and braised venison and bread that took the better part of a morning to rise and bake properly. The snow made the homestead feel sealed against the world in a way that Maggie found, to her own surprise, deeply comfortable. The two of them had grown into each other's rhythms by November, with the easy, unconscious grace of 2 rivers joining. She knew when he needed quiet, and he knew when she needed to talk through something out loud. She knew he was troubled by something when he stood at the south window looking at the mountains longer than usual. And he knew she was tired, not because she said so, but because the sentences in her evening conversation got shorter and more direct than they normally were. On the second snow day, while the storm continued outside and the fire inside was doing its best work, he came in from the barn and stood in the doorway shaking snow from his coat, and she looked at him across the warm kitchen and was hit by a wave of feeling so complete and unambiguous that it was almost physical. A full knowledge of the fact that this was the best thing that had ever happened to her, this house and this man and this life that she had been afraid to want. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which startled him because she was not typically a person who did this without preamble. She heard him exhale, and then his arms came around her, his coat still wet and cold against her cheek, and they stood in the doorway with the snow blowing outside and the fire inside, and she pressed her forehead against his chest. "I love you," she said into his coat. His arms tightened. He said nothing for a moment, and she understood that he was doing what he always did, feeling the thing fully before he put words to it. "Maggie," he said, his voice lower than usual, rumbling in his chest against her forehead. "I have loved you since you handed me your carpet bag like I owed you a favor and told me you weren't inclined to be docile." She laughed into his coat. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Outside, the snow fell on the mountains and the valley, and the homestead, and the sweet pea vines, and the stacked wood, and the root cellar, and the patient horses in the barn. And inside, the fire burned, and the soup was fragrant on the stove. And Maggie and Caleb Holt stood in the doorway and held each other with the simple absolute certainty of two people who have found the right place to be. The winter deepened into December and then January, and the rhythm of the homestead changed with the season. The work contracted around the hearth and the barn and the root cellar, the world outside reduced to the immediate and the essential. Maggie kept the school going through the milder winter weeks and closed it when the weather made the road impassable, spending those days at the kitchen table with her lesson plans and her books. And sometimes Caleb would come in from wherever he had been working and sit across from her without particular purpose, just to be in the same room. And she found this not distracting, but deeply pleasant. She had been at the homestead for 8 months when she woke one morning in February feeling wrong in a way she could not immediately categorize. She lay still for a moment, assessing. Nausea, mild but present. A particular sensitivity to the smell of the coffee that Caleb had put on the stove, which normally she found extremely pleasant. She thought about this carefully. Then she got up and went about her morning with the focused practicality she brought to all important developments. And when Caleb sat down with his coffee, she sat across from him with her hands around her own cup, which she was not drinking, and said, "I believe I may be expecting a child." He set down his cup. He looked at her with his full, complete attention. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but I am fairly certain." He was quiet for a moment in that way he had, fully present in the feeling of something before anything else. "How do you feel?" he said. "Nauseated," she said, "and rather overwhelmed, though I prefer to manage the second one with more dignity than the first." He reached across the table and covered her hand. "We'll go to Redstone Creek," he said. "See Mrs. Greer." Mrs. Greer was the woman who served the valley as its unofficial midwife and medical authority, a formidable woman from Missouri who had delivered approximately 40 children in the territory and brooked no nonsense. "Next week," Maggie said, "when the road is passable again." "Next week," he agreed. He held her hand for another moment and then, in the same way he had said the most important things, turned partly away, voice quiet. He said, "I'm glad, Maggie." "So am I," she said, and was surprised by the size of it, how much she meant it, how fully and completely glad she was. Mrs. Greer confirmed in March what they had already understood in February, with a brevity and competence that Maggie found entirely appropriate. She pronounced Maggie healthy, gave her a list of things to eat and things to avoid, and several pieces of advice about the coming months that were delivered with the no-nonsense clarity of a woman who had done this many times and told her to come back in June. Spring returned to the homestead, with the slow, sure advance of something that has been delayed but never stopped, the snow pulling back from the lower slopes and the creek running high and cold with melt, the first green things appearing in the kitchen garden plot with a tentativeness that Maggie found deeply relatable. She turned the garden beds again, more carefully now, mindful of what Mrs. Greer had said about not overdoing the physical labor, and Caleb appeared behind her with unsettling regularity, to carry the heavier things without announcement. "I am not fragile," she told him on one such occasion. "I know," he said, taking the bucket she'd been about to carry from her. "I just like being useful." She gave him the bucket because she was learning which battles were worth fighting and which were the comfortable variety of concession, not compromise, not defeat, just the small choices that say, "You are here, and I want you to be here." The sweet peas came back in April, growing from the seeds they had dropped the previous fall, and she stood at the south fence one morning and looked at the new green shoots with a warmth in her chest that was about more than flowers. Things persisted. Things returned. She was beginning to understand the theology of it, not in any formal sense, but in the way the Colorado Territory taught it, through seasons and weather and the quiet insistence of the natural world in continuing. She planted the new garden with more ambition than the previous year. More beans, certainly, but also squash and turnips, and a section of herbs she had requested from the seed catalog that Ezra Whitmore could order through the mercantile. She wrote to a bookseller in Denver for additional readers for the school's older students and spent 2 evenings in April composing the letter carefully, arguing the need with the precision of a woman who had learned to be thorough about the things she cared about. Caleb read the draft of the letter one evening while she was washing up. He read it twice, which was his habit when he was reading something that interested him, then set it on the table. "Send it," he said. "I was going to," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just agreeing." She smiled at the dishwater. May came in warm and extraordinary, the way May can in Colorado when the weather's in a generous mood, the whole valley going green and gold and the mountains bright above it. Maggie finished the school year's teaching in the second week of May. Her students, she was proud and privately astonished to note, had learned an enormous amount in 8 months. The boy who had been certain girls couldn't do arithmetic was now the second best arithmetic student in the class, which she considered a significant contribution to his education. Lily Whitmore was reading at a level that would genuinely challenge the readers Maggie had ordered from Denver. The small boy who had commented on her eyes in September had, over the course of the year, become one of her most enthusiastic students. He was named Tommy Briggs, and he had a gift for memorization and recitation that she fully intended to cultivate in the fall. The end-of-year gathering at the schoolhouse was a small community event, the families of Redstone Creek filling the new benches, and the students standing at the front to recite and demonstrate what they had learned. Maggie stood to the side and watched Caleb in the second row. He had come in from the homestead with his good shirt on and his hair cut neatly for the first time since winter, which she knew had cost him something. Watching the children with the expression of a man who found unexpected things moving and did not quite know where to put his face. Afterward, Ezra Whitmore shook her hand with both of his and told her she was the best thing that had happened to Redstone Creek in years, which she accepted with more grace than she usually managed for compliments. On the way home in the wagon, with the late May evening laying long shadows across the valley floor and the mountains going gold above them, Caleb reached over and took her hand without preamble and held it all the way back to the homestead. She was 22 weeks along by the end of May, and the fact of it was visible now, not dramatically but honestly. The slight thickening at her middle, the way she moved with a slightly different balance. She had not changed anything about how she lived except at Caleb's steady insistence to not carry things too heavy and to sit down when she was tired, and she had conceded the point mostly because he was right, and she was honest enough with herself to know when she was right and when she was choosing stubbornness for its own sake. He had a way of looking at her these months that she found impossible to describe with any accuracy and impossible to stop noticing. It was a specific Caleb Holt variety of looking, attentive and warm and steady, and underneath it, something that she could only call wonder, which she found simultaneously absurd and entirely correct. One evening in June, she took his hand and pressed it against the side of her middle where the movement had been strongest all day, and she watched his face when he felt it, this enormous man, this person who could fell a tree and haul stone and stand in a yard unmoved before a man looking for trouble. And the expression on his face was so open and unguarded that she had to look away because the fullness of it was almost too much to receive. "There," she said needlessly. "Yes," he said, barely more than a breath. She put her hand over his. Outside, the June evening moved through the valley in a long, slow exhale, and the mountains stood above them as they always had, and the homestead was warm and sure around them. And she thought, "I have this. I have all of this." Henry Caleb Holt was born on the 14th of August, 1875, in the bedroom of the log house in the Colorado foothills, with Mrs. Greer in attendance and Caleb somewhere in the house. She could hear him periodically through the sounds of the labor, his boots on the floorboards, and the peculiarly helpless quality of his patience. It was a long night and a hard one, the way first births are, and Maggie spent most of it being extremely glad that she was a stubborn person, because stubbornness was what the night required. Mrs. Greer was excellent company. businesslike without being cold, direct without being brutal, and possessed of a deeply calming sense of competence that made even the worst hours feel manageable. In the gray pre-dawn of a Colorado August morning, Henry Caleb Holt arrived and made his opinion of the arrangement known immediately and at considerable volume. Maggie lay with him in the first long quiet after everything, listening to the sound he was making. Outraged, then settling, then finally the particular sound of a brand new person beginning to understand that the world was not perhaps entirely hostile, and she looked at the window where the first light was starting to come through, and she breathed. Caleb came in when Mrs. Greer let him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she watched him look at the two of them, his son, small and wrinkled and already rather opinionated, and Maggie, tired in a way that went all the way through her and also more fully awake than she could remember being. He crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at her, and she could see that he was fighting every instinct he had to hold himself together and losing. "Caleb," she said quietly. "I'm all right," he said, which was clearly only half true, but she understood what he meant. "Come here," she said. He leaned down, and she pressed her forehead against the side of his, and they sat like that for a long moment with the baby between them, and outside the August dawn opened up over the mountains in that extraordinary unearned way it had, as though the world were being given as a gift every single morning, and all you had to do was be awake to receive it. Henry was a demanding and extremely opinionated infant, which Maggie found entirely appropriate, and which Caleb took to with an ease that surprised her more than it should have. He was not, it turned out, a man who was awkward with small creatures. He handled Henry with the same enormous, careful competence he brought to everything, and he woke in the night without being asked, and walked the kitchen with the baby when the crying would not stop, a very large man in the lamplight moving in a slow, patient circle, and she would lie in the bedroom and listen and feel something in her chest that expanded and expanded until she thought it might not fit anymore. Henry's first weeks coincided with the end of summer and the preparation for the second year of school, and Maggie navigated both with the organized determination that was her fundamental nature. She arranged for Mrs. Briggs, Tommy's mother, a capable woman who had 3 of her own, to help with Henry on the 3 days a week Maggie taught, an arrangement that satisfied everyone and gave Henry the additional social stimulation of the Briggs household, which was noisy and warm and extremely educational. The school's second year was richer than the first. 5 new students had been added to the roll, and the older students from the first year arrived in September, carrying themselves with the particular satisfaction of people who knew something and were ready to know more. Maggie had received the books from the Denver bookseller, and they had arrived in good condition, and she unpacked them in the schoolroom the day before the year began with the quiet reverence appropriate to books in a place that had not previously had enough of them. Tommy Briggs recited the preamble of the Constitution from memory on the 3rd day of school, unprompted and correctly, and when Maggie told him that evening to his mother, she watched Mrs. Briggs get tears in her eyes, which she was too practical a woman to let fall, but which were entirely visible and entirely appropriate. The seasons found their rhythm on the homestead and in the town, and the Holts found their place in both. Caleb was known in Redstone Creek as a man to call when something needed to be done correctly, when the church roof needed repairing, when a new family arrived and needed help raising their first cabin, when a fence line dispute needed someone who would listen to both sides and say the honest thing. He did not seek this role, but he did not refuse it, and Maggie watched it happen with a private pride that she expressed to him very seldom, because she suspected he would be embarrassed by it. She was right, which was not unusual. She was known in the town as the teacher, which she had come to understand was one of the more powerful things a person could be in a frontier community. She was also known now as Caleb Holt's wife, which she had expected to find reductive and discovered instead that it was simply descriptive, an accurate piece of information about who she was, among several other accurate pieces. She was a teacher, she was a wife, she was a mother. She was the woman with the cross eyes who had planted sweet peas along the south fence of the Holt homestead, and who argued with the town council when necessary, and who had opinions about library organization and river drainage and the education of girls on the frontier. She was, in the simplest possible sense, herself, fully and without apology, And this was Caleb's doing as much as her own. Not because he had made her into something, but because he had created the conditions in which she stopped being careful about it. Henry took his first steps on a Wednesday in October toward the rooster, which was inadvisable, and fell on his face in the dirt, and sat up and examined the dirt with philosophical interest before trying again. Maggie watched from the doorway of the kitchen, and Caleb came around the corner of the barn in time to see the second attempt, and they looked at each other across the yard with the wild, mutual, wordless joy of two people watching something remarkable. The rooster remained supremely unimpressed. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was a hard one, colder and snowier than the previous year, the kind of Colorado winter that tested the intelligence of your preparations in September and October. The root cellar was well stocked, and the woodpile was enormous, and the house was tight and warm, and the three of them rode it out with the minor complaints and major comforts of a family well suited to its home. Henry became a walker that winter, then a talker. First words, then fragments, then whole opinions delivered with startling confidence for someone of his size. He had Maggie's stubbornness and Caleb's patience in a combination that was going to be, she understood already, both remarkable and exhausting to parent. In January of 1876, a letter arrived from Caleb's brother James in Kentucky. It had been forwarded twice and had the battered look of a letter that had been traveling for some time. Caleb read it at the kitchen table with an expression she had learned to read, the particular stillness that meant something was happening internally that he was managing carefully. He handed it to her when he was done. It was not a long letter. James wrote that their youngest brother, William, had died the previous spring of a fever, and that their father's homestead in Kentucky had been sold, and that James himself was thinking of coming west. He was not sure he would. He was just thinking about it. He had heard Caleb was married. He congratulated him in his clipped and careful way. She handed the letter back. Caleb folded it. "I'm sorry about William," she said. "We weren't close," he said. "After the war." He paused. "He was young when it started, younger than I understood at the time." She waited. "I've been angry at them for a long time," he said. "James and William, for the side they chose." He looked at the folded letter. "William's gone now, and I never—" He stopped. She moved to the bench beside him rather than across the table and put her hand on his arm. "You were 20 years old in a war," she said. "You were all 20 years old in a war. It did things to everyone that they did not choose and could not reverse." He looked at his hands. "Write to James," she said. "Tell him to come." He looked at her. "You don't know him." "No," she said. "But you do, under all of it, and he wrote to you, and that means something, or he wouldn't have bothered." He thought about this for a long moment. Then he nodded. He wrote to James in February. James wrote back in April. In June of 1876, James Holt arrived in Redstone Creek on the morning stage, thin and road-weary, and carrying 10 years of careful distance in the set of his jaw, and stopped dead when Caleb met him at the stage depot and extended his hand. They looked at each other for a moment. James was shorter than Caleb, brown-haired like him, with less bulk but the same quality of stillness. Then James took the hand. Maggie watched them from the wagon with Henry on her hip and thought, yes, this is how things that are broken can sometimes be repaired, not with speeches or apologies or the formal language of reconciliation, but with a handshake on a dusty street in Colorado Territory, and then another day, and then another. James stayed through the summer, sleeping in the lean-to and working alongside Caleb on the homestead, with a quiet diligence that suggested he was as glad to have somewhere to be useful as Caleb was to have the help. He was awkward with Maggie at first, clearly uncertain what to make of her, glancing at her eyes with the sideways curiosity he tried to conceal. And she addressed this on the third day by asking him directly whether he would like to talk about it or simply get on with things. He stared at her for a long moment. "Get on with things," he said. "Good," she said, and handed him a plate of food. He was not Caleb. He had a quicker temper and a rougher edge, and a humor that came out sideways in unexpected places, which she found rather entertaining. He was good with Henry, which was the first thing that made her actually like him. He played with the baby with a comfortable ease that told her he had done it before, and Henry, being Henry, attached himself to this new large person with characteristic lack of hesitation. James rode out in September to look at land in the Northern Valley, 2 days' ride from the Holt homestead, where he had heard a parcel was available at a reasonable price. He came back with the expression of a man who had decided something. "I'm going to file on it," he said. Caleb looked at him. "You're staying?" "There's nothing in Kentucky anymore," James said. "And this place?" He stopped. He looked at the homestead, at the mountains behind it, at Henry staggering importantly across the yard. "This place has things worth staying for." He looked briefly at Maggie, and she understood that this was the most gracious acknowledgment she was likely to get from James Holt, and she received it accordingly. He filed the claim in October and began building his cabin before the weather closed in, with Caleb and Maggie both providing labor and supplies and food and the particular kind of support that family provides, which is different from every other kind. The centennial year, 1876, brought changes to Colorado Territory beyond the arrival of James Holt. Colorado was admitted to the Union as the 38th state on August 1st, which occasioned a celebration in Redstone Creek of considerable enthusiasm. Maggie organized the schoolchildren to participate in the town's Independence Day adjacent celebration, and Tommy Briggs recited part of the Declaration of Independence for the assembled town with a volume and confidence that impressed everyone present, including Tommy himself. Caleb watched from the back of the crowd with his arms folded and the Henry on his shoulders, and an expression that was, for him, positively demonstrative. That fall, Maggie discovered she was expecting again, which she announced to Caleb over breakfast with the same direct practicality she brought to important information. He received this in his usual way, fully, quietly, with the whole of himself. "Good," he said. He paused. "Is it good? For you?" "Yes," she said. "Henry needs someone to argue with." "He argues with the rooster," Caleb said. "The rooster is insufficiently challenging," she said. He smiled. The real one, the full one that she had come to understand, was hers in a way that very few things were fully anyone's. Clara Jane Holt was born in June of 1877, on a morning that smelled of wild roses and pine and the particular Colorado mountain air that would always, from that day forward, smell to Maggie like arrival. She was smaller than Henry had been and considerably quieter, examining the world from the first with a thoughtful attention that Maggie recognized as her father's. She had Caleb's coloring, dark hair, deep eyes, and she regarded Henry's introduction to her person with the calm assessment of someone who had already formed opinions. Henry, for his part, was initially skeptical, and then, when she wrapped her small hand around his finger, immediately and permanently devoted. Caleb held Clara on the porch that evening, the baby asleep against his chest, his enormous hands entirely gentle, and Maggie sat beside him with Henry asleep on her lap, and the June evening moved over the homestead in that long golden way it had, and the sweet peas along the south fence were blooming for the third time, purple and pink and white. "You did that again," she said, nodding at the flowers. He looked at them. "They come back on their own now," he said. "I know," she said, "but you planted more seeds in April." A pause. "I might have," he said. She looked at him. This man who had walked through a crowd of people to a contract table on an afternoon in May 3 years ago, for reasons he had probably not fully understood himself at the time, and had said, "I will take her," as though he had known in some wordless and entirely reliable way that this was the right direction for his life to go. "Caleb," she said. He said, watching the mountains go gold. "I want to tell you something." He looked at her, attentive, the baby still against his chest. "I was not hopeful when I came here," she said. "I was practical, and I was self-sufficient, and I was determined, and I had made peace with the idea that those things were sufficient, and that wanting more than they could give was foolishness." She looked down at Henry, sleeping with the complete and excellent confidence of a child who does not yet understand that the world is sometimes difficult. "You made me hope," she said, "without doing anything in particular, simply by being who you are." He was quiet for a long moment. "You already had it," he said. "The hope. It was there." I saw it in you the first day. You could not have seen that, she said. I saw you standing there with your arms crossed and your chin up, he said, and I thought, that person has not given up. Whatever they look like to everyone else, that person has not given up. He looked at her steadily. That is hope, Maggie. That has always been hope. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you are more perceptive than you allow people to know. Don't tell anyone, he said. I have a reputation. She laughed, and Clara stirred against his chest, and Henry shifted on her lap, and the evening continued its slow and perfect progress across the Colorado sky. The years settled into the good weight of a life fully inhabited. Maggie taught the Redstone Creek school every fall and winter, building it year by year into something real, acquiring more books, establishing a small lending collection for the families in the valley, advocating to the town council for improvements she refused to stop requesting until they happened. The council learned to both respect and slightly dread her committee appearances, which combined the structure of a legal brief with the relentlessness of a mountain winter. Caleb expanded the homestead's north pasture in 1878 and increased the herd, and James's neighboring claim was producing its first real harvest. The two brothers worked together with an ease that had taken time to build but was solid now, built, like everything on that land, on time and honesty and the willingness to do the next necessary thing. Henry at 3 was exactly what Maggie had predicted, opinionated, physically fearless, and unable to walk past a problem without attempting to solve it. He followed Caleb everywhere and observed everything with the intense seriousness of a small person cataloging the world. And Caleb took this following with the same patient acceptance he brought to all of Henry's operations, explaining what he was doing and why in the calm, even-toned way that he talked to Henry, because Henry was a person, and that was how you talked to people. Clara at 1 was quieter, observant, and had opinions about her food that she expressed by examining each item carefully before deciding whether it merited consumption. She had Caleb's patience and Maggie's standards, and the combination was both admirable and occasionally inconvenient. On a Saturday in September of 1878, Maggie stood at the south fence in the morning light, looking at the sweet peas, going to seed now for the 4th season, the vines thick and abundant along the fence line, making a purple and pink curtain in the fall air. She heard the door of the house open, and Caleb came out, Henry riding on his back with his small hands in Caleb's dark hair, Clara on his arm, and he crossed the yard and came to stand beside her at the fence. 4 years, she said. Almost, he said. Henry, from his position on Caleb's back, reached out and grabbed a sweet pea vine with the thorough interest of someone examining evidence. Caleb caught his hand with practiced ease. Clara looked at the flowers with the expression of a person cataloging new data. I would not change any of it, Maggie said. Not the stage in Redstone Creek, not the wagon ride, not the chicken coop argument, not any of it. Neither would I, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. She could do this, standing beside him, because the difference in their heights made it natural. And he turned his head and pressed his lips to the top of her hair, and Henry made a sound of protest at being ignored, and Clara grabbed a fistful of Caleb's shirt, and the sweet peas moved in the September breeze, purple and pink and white, persistent and beautiful, and returning every year like a promise that was also a fact. She was not, Maggie thought, the woman who had stood on that stage with her arms crossed and her chin up, daring the world to underestimate her. She was still that woman, exactly. Still stubborn, still direct, still constitutionally unwilling to be docile, but she was also more now, in the way that rivers are more when they join. Not diminished by the joining, not subsumed, but enlarged and deepened and going somewhere more interesting than either of them had managed alone. She had been the last bride nobody wanted, and she had been wanted in the only way that mattered, seen clearly and chosen clearly and held onto with the steady, enormous, unhurried certainty of a man who knew a good thing when he found it and was not going to let anyone's opinion of it alter his own. She had come to Colorado with a battered carpetbag and 22 years of stubbornness, and they had built, a home and a family and a life that was larger and more honest and more full of joy than anything she had known to want. She taught 32 children now in the Redstone Creek school. She had sweet peas along the south fence, She had a son who argued with a rooster, and a daughter who judged her breakfast with the seriousness it deserved, and a husband whose hands were warm and whose eyes were steady, and who had walked through a crowd and signed a piece of paper on a May afternoon because he had looked at her and seen something worth looking at. The mountains stood above them in the September morning, white-capped and immovable and entirely indifferent to human affairs in the way that only very old and very large things can be, and also somehow specifically, particularly present, like witnesses who had seen everything and judged nothing and simply continued, as mountains do, as the seasons turned and the life below them went on. Caleb looked at her and she looked back at him, her eyes finding their own directions, always, and still landing on him. "Ready to go inside?" he said. "In a moment," she said. She looked at the mountains one more time. Then she turned back to her husband and her children and her home. "All right," she said, "let's go." He took her hand and they walked back across the yard together, the September sun warming the log walls of the house and the smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, steady line toward the Colorado sky, and the sweet peas blooming behind them in all their colors, and the morning opening ahead of them like every good morning does, ready and bright and entirely, wonderfully theirs.